By the end of 1980, there were more than 4,000 working men's clubs operating across Britain. They employed tens of thousands of staff, fed and watered millions of members, and in certain northern towns served as the true centre of civic life, more so than the church, more so than the pub, and certainly more so than the town hall. Within a generation, most of them were gone. Not closed gradually, not retired gracefully, gutted. If you remember walking into one of those clubs, the low ceiling, the fug of cigarettes, the particular sound of a snooker ball dropping into a leather pocket, then you already know what was lost. This is file number 14 of the Forgotten Britain archive. The Working Men's Club did not begin as a place to drink. That detail has been lost in the retelling, and it matters. When Reverend Henry Solly founded the Club and Institute Union in 1862, the explicit aim was sobriety. He wanted to give working men somewhere to read, to debate, to improve themselves, somewhere that was not the gin palace. The irony, of course, is that within 2 decades, the clubs had quietly defeated their founders' intentions. By the turn of the century, the CIU had negotiated special licensing arrangements that allowed clubs to sell beer at prices a public house simply could not match. Solly's reading rooms had become something altogether different. They had become the working man's living room, writ large. And what a living room! The structure of a working men's club in its prime, say, a West Yorkshire club in 1965, was unlike anything else in British social life. You paid your membership, usually no more than a few shillings a year. Your card was stamped. You walked through a door that was, in law and in fact, a private members' club, which meant the licensing restrictions that governed every public house in the land simply did not apply in the same way. The committee elected annually from the membership set the prices. They bought the barrels. They hired the concert secretary. They decided when the club opened and when it closed. No landlord, no brewery, no one above them in the chain. Every penny of profit stayed inside the building and was either kept in reserve or fed back to the members in the form of lower prices, better entertainment, and the occasional dividend. A pint that cost 2 shillings in the pub next door cost 14 pence in the club. For a steel worker in Sheffield or a miner in County Durham, that differential was not a curiosity. It was the difference between a social life and the absence of one. If you grew up visiting these clubs with a parent or a grandparent, you will remember the unwritten geography of them. There was always a concert room, usually at the back or upstairs, separated from the tap room by a set of double doors that swung with a particular heaviness. The tap room was men only for most of the post-war decades, a rule that now seems remarkable, but was then simply the air the institution breathed. The concert room was different. On a Friday or Saturday evening, it was the concert room that mattered. The chairman would bang his gavel, the act would come on, and for 2 hours, working families who had spent the week in factories, in mines, in mills, and behind shop counters, sat in a room together and watched something that in certain cases was genuinely extraordinary. The Working Men's Club circuit was, for decades, the most significant live entertainment network in the country. That is not sentiment. It is accounting. At its peak in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the concert circuit connected more than 4,000 venues across the North and Midlands. It sustained careers, it broke careers, it paid wages that variety theatres in the West End could not always match. The names who came up through it are not obscure. Roy Chubby Brown started at clubs across Teesside. Bobby Thompson, the Little Waster, was a deity in Tyne and Wear club rooms before most of the country had heard of him. Marty Kane cut her teeth in South Yorkshire clubs before Opportunity Knocks made her a household name in 1975. The clubs were an infrastructure for culture that had been built entirely without the participation of the BBC, without impresarios, without arts councils, and without any form of subsidy. The members had built it themselves because they wanted entertainment, and they had the means and the collective will to make it happen. If you remember any of this, if you sat in one of those concert rooms, or your parents did, or your grandparents spoke of it, leave a note below. Every comment is part of the archive. The relationship between the clubs and the industries that fed them was not incidental. It was organic, almost umbilical. The Workington Club in Cumberland drew the majority of its members from the steelworks at the end of Moss Bay Road. The pit villages of South Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire each had their own club, sometimes two, funded in part by contributions from the colliery welfare schemes that the National Coal Board administered after nationalisation in 1947. These were not coincidences of geography. When a steelworks closed, membership at the local club fell within months. When a colliery was wound down, the club that had served it for 70 years was usually on borrowed time within 5 years. The two could not be decoupled because they had never been separate things. The club was the social expression of the workplace, and the workplace was what made the membership possible, which is why the 1980s did not just change the clubs. The 1980s removed the substrate on which the entire ecosystem rested. Between 1979 and 1992, Britain lost approximately 200,000 jobs in the steel industry alone. Coal went further. 170 collieries operating in 1980 had become a dozen by the end of the decade. The men who had been the core membership of working men's clubs across the North and the Midlands were not just losing their jobs, they were losing the social identity that the job had given them, and with it, the habit and the meaning of the club. A man on the dole for 3 years does not renew his club membership at the same rate as a man earning a regular wage. That is not a moral judgment. It is a financial reality that the clubs could not absorb at scale. But the industries alone do not account for the full collapse, and it would be too simple to stop there. The clubs had internal vulnerabilities that had been accumulating since the 1970s, and by the 1980s, those vulnerabilities had compound weight. The committee structure, the great democratic strength of the CIU model, had become, in many clubs, a source of paralysis. Committees elected every 12 months by members who had been members for 30 years were not always well suited to making commercial decisions under duress. When brewery representatives arrived offering long-term supply contracts with upfront cash incentives, some committees signed without fully understanding that they were surrendering the very pricing independence that had made club beer affordable in the first place. By the mid-1980s, a significant number of clubs in the North East and Yorkshire had committed to agreements that tied them to brewery prices for 5, 7, even 10 years. The structural advantage had been traded away for short-term liquidity. Satellite television accelerated the process. When BSB and Sky launched in 1989 and 1990, the clubs faced a choice: invest in the dish, the decoder, the screen, and the wiring required to show live football to a membership that increasingly expected it, or watch those members drift to the pub that had already made the investment. Many clubs made the upgrade, many could not afford to. But even those that did discovered a problem they had not anticipated. Showing live football on a large screen is not the same thing as running a concert night. Football brings in men on specific evenings. It does not bring in couples. It does not bring in the mixed family custom that had sustained the concert room across 3 decades. The clubs that pivoted to football found themselves busier on a Saturday afternoon and emptier on a Friday night than at any point in their history. The working women, who had been the silent engine of club culture for 50 years, began voting with their feet. For most of the club's history, women had not been allowed in the tap room at all. They had been confined to the concert room and, in some clubs, to a side lounge that carried the name the ladies' room, without apparent irony. The CIU had resisted formal gender equality long past the point of social acceptability. Not until 1989 did the union vote to allow women the same membership rights as men, and even then individual clubs could opt out of the rule. By the time the clubs caught up with the culture, a generation of younger women had already decided they preferred the pub. That decision proved irreversible. You do not come back to the institution that told you, for decades, that you were a visitor in your own community's social space. What is sometimes forgotten, when people speak about the decline of these clubs, is the physical nature of what disappeared. We are not discussing a shift in consumer preference that can be measured in spreadsheets. We are discussing buildings large, specific, difficult buildings that had been constructed at considerable communal expense and that now stood empty in the centres of towns where there was no longer an obvious use for them. A working men's club is not a pub. You cannot easily convert it into a wine bar or a gastropub. The concert room is too large, the bar too institutional, the car park laid out wrong for the boutique experience that urban regeneration schemes prefer. Many of the buildings that were not demolished simply sat stripped of their contents, boarded up, waiting for a planning application that never came, or that came and was refused. You can still find them in certain parts of County Durham, in the Dearne Valley, along the back roads of West Cumberland. The buildings are still there. The institution they held is not. There is a figure that does not appear in most histories of this subject, and it deserves to be said plainly. In 1960, a working man in a northern industrial town might reasonably have expected to spend 3 or 4 evenings a week in the local club. He would pay a few pence for each pint. He would know the steward by name. He would vote on committee decisions. He would watch an act perform on a stage his membership had partially paid for. His wife would join him on the weekend. His children would wait in the lobby, drinking Vimto from small bottles, while the adults had their evening. The total annual cost of that social life, the membership, the drinks, the occasional trip to a larger club in town for a special act, was comfortably within the budget of an industrial wage. It was designed to be. That was the point. By 1995, that same man, in that same town, had nowhere comparable to go. The club had closed. The industry had closed. The social network that both had sustained the committees, the concert secretaries, the working stewards, the club organisers, had dispersed. What replaced it was not an equivalent. The pub remained. But the pub was a commercial transaction, not a membership. The leisure centre offered sport, but not community. The bingo hall offered company, but not the layered, multi-generational social fabric that the club had provided for over a century. What had been lost was not just a place to drink, it was a place to belong to. This was file. No. 14. There are 99 more in the archive. Subscribe and turn the page with us.